All right. Uh,
Okay.
Good morning, Dr. Rigel. How are you?
Good morning, Steve. How are you? Good to see you.
Likewise, Darrell. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the Beating Melanoma project. And for all the audience out there, we have another melanoma expert. This time is Dr. Darrel Rigel, who is a clinical professor of dermatology at the Mount Sinai Icahn School of Medicine. He's actually one of the most recognized dermatologists and melanoma expert in the world. He has over 1,000 presentations and numerous publications on the topic of melanomas and skin cancer. He has served all the leadership position in dermatology, including the American Academy of Dermatology, I believe the Academy of Dermatological Surgery Association, and he was also the director of American Board of Dermatology. And the accolade goes on and on. And I think one of the most interesting things is he served as the dermatologist for the New York Yankees. Is that correct?
That's correct. You're making me sound very important, Steve. I don't know if I'm that important, but thank you.
You are one of the most important. Well, and also, just to add that, you and I known each other for a long time, and I spent some time in NYU. You were down in NYU, so that's our past history. So once again, thank you so much for taking the time to participate at the in this meeting, Beating Melanoma project. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So we got a lot to cover. And one of the things is you always talked a great deal about the epidemiology of melanoma, the rising incidence over the decades. And you've been warning people for a long time about this epidemics of melanoma. Can you just comment a little bit about this? Like give us some statistics about the incidence and death rate associated with melanoma, and how does this change over the years?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because melanoma is one of the few cancers that's still increasing significantly in rate. And this is despite everything that we have out there looking at this. In terms of the incidence, number of cases, it's just gone up almost exponentially. We first started looking at this data in 1980. And at that point, 1 in 250 Americans would get a melanoma. This has dropped now where it's now down to about 1 in 45 will get it sometime during their lifetime. That's invasive melanoma. And if you look at in situ melanomas, put it all together, it's about 1 in 24 or 1 in 25. So it's really gone up dramatically for that reason. And part of that is, it's interesting, if you look at incidence versus mortality of melanoma, deaths from melanoma, they've been relatively flat over the last decade or so. And that's probably because of early detection. If you think about it, a lot of cancers, the incidence and the mortality are basically related. Think of like pancreatic cancer, basically everybody who gets it dies from it. So the numbers are the same. But in melanoma, right now, about 90% of the patients who get melanoma survive it. And for that reason, it really makes a difference in terms of the mortality versus the incidence. Now, why that's important, when you look at prevention measures for melanoma, we think about primary prevention or secondary prevention. Primary prevention is wear sunscreen, protect yourself from the sun, just try not to get it. Secondary prevention is if you have something, get it looked at quickly so it's treated early. Primary prevention impacts on incidence. Secondary prevention on early detection impacts on mortality. And like I said, if you look at a pancreatic cancer, it doesn't matter. But with melanoma, there are different factors that are involved because so many people are now surviving from it. So that to me is one of the most intriguing things, because do we focus our resources on primary prevention, wear sunscreen, stay out of the sun, wear clothing, or do we focus our resources on the other areas like early detection, which really impacts on mortality? Both of them are kind of important, and you could argue it either way. But it seems lately that the effort has been more effective on mortality than it's been on incidence.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right on. That is, melanoma is one of those diseases that early detection followed by prompt treatment that give you the best prognosis. And I think in the last, I would say 8 years, 5 years or so, we actually have some great therapies against advanced stage melanoma, like the immunotherapies or targeted therapies. And Why do you think there is such a rise incidence? Is it what is all attributed to?
Well, there's some controversy there, to be fair, but I think the rising incidence is real, and part of it is there's a delay of 10 or 20 years from the time you actually do the damage so you see the melanoma. So I love when patients come in and say, "Oh, I got a bad sunburn last summer, and this caused my melanoma." Well, probably not, but it might cause one 5, 10, 20 years down the line. But so we're seeing the effects of what people did in the 80s and 90s, basically, at this point, even the early 2000s. And really, we didn't have the awareness or even the quality of sunscreens that we have available, protective measures that we have. SPF 15 sunscreens weren't really available until about 1985-ish or so. And the higher intensity sunscreens weren't available till much later. So we're sort of seeing the effects of that to some extent. And hopefully we'll start seeing the rates of melanoma, the incidence begin to flatten. In Australia, those rates are beginning to flatten, especially in younger people. And typically what we see in the US is that we follow the trends in Australia about 5 or 10 years later, if you look at the
Mm.
curves. So I'm hoping that that will continue to happen and we'll start to see the incidence numbers begin to at least flatten, if not begin to fall. There's so much information out there. And as you alluded to, melanoma is probably one of the most clear-cut cases of a cancer. We know the cause. We know a change in behavior can lower your risk, right? It's just, we don't know that for all these other cancers. We know it for melanoma. So I think that's really a difference too. And as you also alluded to, one of the things that's made a difference in mortality is these the immunologic therapies that are out there, the PD-1s, the BRAF inhibitors, all those things that really make a difference. 10 years ago, if you had metastatic melanoma, we were done. It didn't matter.
Yeah, yeah. We didn't really
Now,
have anything.
but now it's a little different. I mean, there's no cure, but if you look at the data, the people that survive out 3 years, pretty much maybe a third to a half of the people will do that. They pretty much survive out another 5 to 7 years that we have data on right now. So that's really made a major impact. I mean, look at Jimmy Carter, okay?
Yeah,
Did his
Katrina.
90s, brain mets, and still, in fact, is alive 6 years now on a PD-1 inhibitor. So there is some hope for some people. We're not at a cure yet, but we're getting closer.
We're getting very close. I want to come back a little bit, just flesh out some of the stuff you talked about, the controversy. You said that the incidence is real because you mentioned we didn't have the good sunscreen, and some of the sunscreen did not protect against UVA radiation early on. And also on top of which, there was a lot of a tanning bed use, that aspect of it. And the controversy, some of the controversy is basically people are saying that there's an increasing selection bias, meaning that more people you screen, and of course you will find more melanoma. That was also another aspect of it. Is that correct?
See, I don't think that's true. I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Um, let's take in situ melanomas out of the play here for now, okay? Just look at invasive melanomas. If you just look at invasive melanomas, there's not, at some point, they're going to reach a point where they're going to be diagnosed and treated, or the patient's going to die from them, right? I mean, you can't just not treat them. So that being the case, no matter how many patients you screen or see, it's going to be the same number of cases that you see that come out of this. And one of the arguments about screening bias I think is really wrong is that if you look at prostate cancer, for example, when PSA screens came into effect, into happening, which is basically in the around 1990 or so, what you saw is a marked increase in detection because you took a bunch of cases out of the pool earlier with early detection. And then you saw the rate drop dramatically because what happened was all those early cases that would have been detected a year or 2 or 3 down the line had already been detected. And then it went back up to the same level. So in other words, the net curve was kind of like this, up, down, and then continuing. So it was like the slope was the same. The curve, you took some cases out early, it went up, it went down. So that's when you see the effect of screening. We do not see that with melanoma incidents. The big screening events started probably the late 80s. The American Academy of Dermatology had a program. It was kind of interesting, actually, where they had all the members do an extra contribution. And the idea behind it was to show the importance of dermatology. And part of it was to realize dermatologists treat skin cancer. We're not just popping pimples and shooting toxins and fillers. We do some important stuff. So when that word got out there, people started coming in, and before then, nobody ever walk in and say, "Give me a skin check or a mole check." That didn't exist. But now, that, as you know, Steve, that's pretty common, and for a good reason. It should happen with that. So, I think if you look at that data, compare it to prostate PSA screening with the impact of melanoma screening, which really started in around 1990 or so and really grew, you just don't see that on the incidence curve. So to me, that's probably the strongest argument why screening or increased screening has not really made a difference.
So the bottom line that incidence is real, so everyone should really go out and protect themselves. All right, let's shift the gear a little bit. You talked about the primary prevention, which is sunscreen, stay out of the sun. We will cover that topic a little bit later. And let's talk about secondary prevention, that is screening, looking at patients. And I'm really delighted to sort of asking you about the ABCDs of melanoma, because you and Dr. Alkaff, who was my mentor and started early on, you guys, the ones who did the initial study and came up with the acronym, right? And maybe you can just tell us what the ABCD stand for, and maybe you can give us some interesting anecdote about how you guys come up with this acronym.
Well, sure. My late colleague Bob Friedman and I, we were junior faculty at the time. This was 1984, so it's a long time ago. And we were sitting in the NYU dermatology library and trying to figure out a way, how could we describe early melanoma to non-dermatologists? So we went and got slides, Kodachrome slides of about 20 early melanomas, and brought them to senior faculty at the time and showed them to it, say, "What is this?" And they'd say melanoma. And if you asked why, the answer invariably was because it looks like one.
Yeah.
And it is kind of a gestalt thing if you've seen enough of them. But the trick was, we wanted people who weren't super experienced. How could we teach them what to look for? So we decided it had to be as easy as the ABC. And we came up with A for asymmetry. And typically early melanomas, one side doesn't look like the other. You can't really draw a line down the difference. And that's because there's differential growth that occurs. B was for border, irregular border. Most moles are kind of have a clear-cut border. Melanomas may have an indistinct or a jagged, irregular border. C was for color. Typically, most moles are solid in color, but melanomas have different shades of browns. And if you get further along the line, it's a very patriotic disease. You see reds, whites, and blues with it, as you see various things with it as it gets more advanced. We wanted to catch it when it was early. So we actually went down the hall and spoke to our mentor and your mentor, Alkaff, and said, "What do you think of this?" And he goes, "Well, you got to have a size criteria because everybody will run in with real little things." So we looked at the NYU database at that time, and 95% of the lesions in the database were greater than 6 millimeters or a quarter of an inch. So that's where the diameter of the size of a pencil eraser, a quarter of an inch, et cetera, 6 millimeters came in. And to that, about 20 years later, we added E because evolving and change is important too. We actually went through the entire alphabet, Steve, and X was tough. X was X-ray resistant, but we got them all. And but I think it has to be easy, and the ABCDs have really, to me, have been very exciting because I know it's been translated to many languages. I've been in, when we first came out with these. Two good stories. One is, I can tell you, we got letters before emails, letters from people thanking us for their early detection that came into NYU. And my own mother, this is a true story. My mother was blonde, blue-eyed, very fair, and spent a lot of time out in the sun and was living in Arizona. And I sent her a copy of the article when it came out in CA. And she called me and said, I got this spot on my arm that looks a little bit like one of these pictures.
Wow.
She went to see the University of Arizona, went and had a biopsy. It was a 0.1 millimeter melanoma. So she lived another 40 years. That was pretty good. But, so I even saved my own mother's life with that. That's a true story. And,
well, I think the ABCDs have saved a lot of lives. I mean, I think this is the first, when I learned about melanoma many, many years ago in med school, that was the first thing that was taught to the medical student, right? And it is one of the very catchy acronyms that have definitely used very widely and successfully for public health messagings. And I think over the years, the ABCDs of melanoma was very good detecting large melanoma, but now we are able to detect smaller and smaller melanoma that still, does not fit some of the criteria, but it's very, very useful. And we have the ABCDs and you guys, meaning you, Dr. Alkoff and Bob Freeman, you guys were also instrumental in coming up with some of the instructional card and pamphlets about self-exam. Is that right?
Yeah, we did. And that was actually at the same time, Bob had a house. It was in the winter, and Bob had a house out in Long Island on the beach. And Al and Bob and I spent the weekend, and we were trying to come up with simple ways to do skin self-examination. And the idea really came from breast self-examination that women are trained to do on a regular basis and feel their breasts and feel for lumps and things of that sort. So we wanted to see if we could do something that was analogous to that for skin self-examination. And we came up with a 10-step method that was also published in that same issue of CA in 1985 that was designed to look at every part of your body, including a double mirror, to put a mirror in the front and a mirror behind you in various ways to try to get the back and everything with it. It's also much easier if you have a partner helping you doing that, looking at some of the stuff. But
why don't you walk us through, I want to hear from the originator of this, how to do self-exam. How do you recommend to do self-exam to your patients right now, basically?
Well, we have that, we gave this to the Skin Cancer Foundation and the Academy, and they have those bookmarks that have the different steps in it. But basically, I have people look in the mirror of their face, work in their face, and then look on the front of their body as much as they can from the top down, and then look with a two-way mirror in the front and a full-length mirror in the back and a hand mirror in the front, and try to look at the back and everything with this. It's hard to examine your own scalp unless you've lost some hair like I have. A little harder for you. But the bottom line is that you need to learn your skin. That's what really matters, because then if something new pops up, it's new and it should be looked at. And not every new thing is bad. You know that.
Yeah.
You weren't born with a lot of your moles, so therefore it's not unusual to have new moles come out. The average American has 24 moles. I don't know who did bother doing that count, but somebody did it. And so they're not all bad. But if you see a new one popping up, especially over the age of 40, you have to look and say, gee, is there a problem with this? Or should I see my dermatologist and get it checked? That's the easiest thing to do. I really hate it when somebody comes in and they say, yeah, I've had this spot for a year and I've just been too busy to come in, and you're looking at an advanced melanoma already, and you're looking really at a death sentence in most cases. And you say, God, I wish they came in earlier. I wish we could have done that. And you just can't do that easily. So to me, the learning your own skin, that's the most important part of self-examination. So
you're so right. You're so right about this central message, because when I tell my patients sometimes to do self-exam, and some of the initial pushback was, I don't know what I'm looking at. I have so many, right? But I just basically tell them, get familiarized with your own skin, look for change, look for new lesions, look for something that, have symptoms, pain, itching, bleeding.
Right.
And the bottom line is they are not trained to be a dermatologist. They're just basically serve as an extra pair of eyes. If they see something, come into the physician's office early, get the melanoma picked off early, basically.
I totally agree. I mean, that's the key to it. It's just, if you're suspicious of a spot, get it looked at. I mean, I was actually at the British Open golf tournament this summer in Scotland. And I was amazed to see in Scotland that they're all over the tournament grounds. There were big signs about wear sunscreen, protect yourself. And then they had a line on the bottom, which I hadn't seen before, which I really liked. When in doubt, check it out. Okay.
That's a really, really great service.
I have to give them credit for that. But they had at least 40 or 50 of these signs all around the tournament with sunscreen dispensers there. This is in Scotland, right? And it turned out it was pretty sunny during the tournament, but it was good to see that.
Well, this is a perfect segue. Let's talk about sunscreen, because I know you've done a lot of sunscreen work. You and I sort of share some of the work together. Bottom line is a couple of questions, right? Does sunscreen work in preventing skin cancer, preventing melanoma?
To me, I think the answer is clearly yes. There's some studies out there. The challenge has always been, a lot of the studies are retrospective, right? So if I asked you, how much sunscreen did you use 10 years ago or 5 years ago, there's going to be a lot of noise in that answer, because nobody's going to really remember that perfectly. Yep. But I think Adele Green studies in Australia prospectively, to me, have been pretty definitive on that, where they looked at 10 years of People using sunscreen every day are basically using when they felt like it.
Yeah.
And the difference in melanoma incidence was significant. So I think it's clear that that makes a difference. And again, as we talked about this earlier, but a simple behavioral change can really make a difference in your melanoma risk to do this. And I think that's been pretty clearly shown at this point.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think before there was some controversy. People think that people who use sunscreen may actually have more incidence of melanoma, but there was some sort of selection bias. There's some sort of recall bias. But the Darrel Green study really put an end to it. And then, they followed people for 10 years, I think 1,600 or so patients.
Right.
But they were also only using a really low SPF of 16, not what we have today, right? And then I think they show like 50% reduction in incidence of melanoma for the group that was given sunscreen for free compared to the other group that didn't give a sunscreen, but they were, they can use it essentially.
Right. And no, it was a pretty definitive study to look at that. And some of the studies where they said, yeah, the people that use sunscreen more get more melanomas, but they're also the fairer skinned people. So
Sure.
you had to take the phenotype out, the skin type out to really balance things to do that. So, to me, I think that I feel very comfortable recommending this to my patients. I think it's important. It makes a difference. And it's really safe, Steve. The FDA coming out with talking about absorption studies, some of these chemicals get absorbed into your skin. My response to that is two things. One is we've been using these same sunscreen ingredients for 30 years now, most of them. There's some new ones. But the bottom line is if all these hypothetical risks were true, we would have expected to see those. And we're not seeing them at this point. And I know the FDA is suggesting experiments to see what the absorption does and a variety of things along those lines. My answer to that is this experiment is done by tens of millions of Americans every weekend during the summer months where they're applying the sunscreen. We're not seeing those hypothetical risks. And with that many people using sunscreen over that period of time, if the risks were there, I believe you'd see it.
I just want to give some background to the audience. What Dr. Rigel is talking about is, FDA did two studies about 2-3 years ago. And what they did was they put, I think, 2 milligrams liters. Sorry, let me repeat that again. So I just want to give some colors to what Dr. Rigel is talking about. So FDA did 2 studies and they give their subject, I believe, 2 milligram per centimeter square concentration of sunscreen, use it 4 times a day, cover the whole body, and then they draw blood and they actually show some of the UV filter actually gets absorbed into the bloodstream. It sort of exceeded the level 0.5 nanograms per mLs. And so that triggered this whole aspect about studying. And you're absolutely right. Not only millions of Americans using sunscreen, people across the world are using sunscreen. Right? And then I think the FDA, the most important thing is FDA also made a statement that people should not stop using sunscreen. And you have to look at the risk and benefit ratio. Why don't we talk about something else? This is another one of the controversy people talk about. That is, people say that you don't really need high SPF you don't really need high SPF sunscreen, right? And because I know you did a lot of those work on the beach, on the ski slopes, and tell us a little bit about your study and tell us about your preference using high SPF, low SPF, and that controversy.
Sure. I mean, as you know, the FDA is talking about, and they've gone back and forth a little bit, but it looks like they're going to be putting a cap of 60 plus on sunscreens. I am opposed to that for a variety of reasons and just practical reasons. One is there's an advantage to the higher SPFs in using them. And the reason is that SPF is rated when people apply 2 milligrams per square centimeter to their body of sunscreen. If most people would do that, they'd be as white as your lab coat, Steve. Well, so people under apply sunscreen. They really do. And they apply typically 25 to 50% of the rated amount. Now, what that means is if you're applying a SPF 50, or let's make it SPF 60, which is a 60 plus now, if you're applying 50% of the rated amount, you're only getting a 30. Applying 25% of the rated amount, you're only getting a 15 effectively, or something close to that. So the higher SPFs are more forgiving in real world environments. That's number one. The second thing that's really important about this is that with the higher SPFs, you're really getting in some ways better coverage in the real world settings. So what I mean by that is we did two ski studies where we had people do what's called a split face study, where in other words, you put one sunscreen on one side of your face, the other sunscreen on the other side of your face. And some people had left, right, and some people had them flipped right, left. And so we wanted to see, were you more likely to sunburn? You were allowed to reapply sunscreen when you wanted to. We did the original study with a small number of people with SPF 50 versus 85, and the SPF 50 people burned more.
Did you say 50 versus 85?
Right. And the
Wow.
50 actually, because in real world, this was in skiing, so very high intensity UV, right? But we then did a larger study with 200 subjects, and we looked at SPF 50 versus SPF 100. Now, we did this in March in Vail, Colorado, which is at over 8,000 feet at the base and 11,000 feet at the top. So that's sunnier than it would be at the beach in June in New York. It's a very strong UV. We had people apply, they didn't know what they were applying. The two tubes were just not marked, and just A and B, so they knew you right or left to use. And we had them apply the sunscreen. We had them come back and evaluate for sunburn. And it turned out the SPF 50 side was 11 times more likely to sunburn than the SPF 100 side.
That's kind of amazing, because you think 50 is pretty high already, right? And in that environment, and they still get burned.
Well, that's the thing. So we broke it down in a bunch of ways. We weighed the tubes of sunscreen to see, did they use the 100 more than 50? They weighed the same. It didn't matter. We also looked at the different skin types, from very light to darker skin. Didn't matter. The 50 side burnt more. We looked at number of, did people reapply the 50 or the 100 more often? Didn't make a difference. It was the same. Went through all these different things. Now, again, this is a very high ultraviolet environment. Sure. It's more than just going to, I don't know, going out and walking out in September or something somewhere. But still, it really made a difference. And the feeling was, again, because people underapply. So some of them who were putting the 50 maybe are underapplying, and just getting the effects of a 15 or a 20 in that environment, which probably is not enough. We did another study that we had published also a couple of years ago, comparing sunscreen to shade. And that was published in JAMA Derm. And the idea behind that, we had people who were in a beach umbrella, and they were actually under an umbrella that had a effective protection of equivalent of an SPF of 1,000. So it was pretty blocking, versus using sunscreen. People don't realize when you're in the shade under an umbrella, there's still some UV that gets in, because the rays don't come down straight. They bounce off dust in the air and everything with it. So they may not come down vertically, they come at an angle. So it's obviously not pitch black under the umbrella, right? Some light's getting through from that, the same way some UV gets through. So it turned out actually the umbrella people got more sunburning and more tanning and sunburning, darker than did those who had the sunscreen on that round. It was SPF 100 sunscreen outside. And then we did a similar study that I was only tangentially involved, but Henry Lim did the primary work with this, with 5 days of beachgoers. And it turned out, in fact, that same thing, that you were much more likely to sunburn with the 50 than the 100. So, it's just clearly the higher SPF sunscreens are more forgiving. So that's a second reason for it. The third reason I'm opposed to the cap is just a practical one, and that if we really put this cap of SPF 60 plus on, there will be no incentive for a sunscreen manufacturer to make a better sunscreen, so they won't get credit for it. So to me, this will impede research in better sunscreens, and that's probably what bothers me the most.
Yeah, great summary. Before we get to the last controversies, I want to touch upon one more thing. When we talk about photo protection, we all advocate for the comprehensive approach, that is sun avoidance, seeking shade, clothing, and very last, using sunscreen. And people should just remember that we talked a lot about sunscreen because there's a lot of controversy associated with it. Really quickly, coral reef. And that's another one of the controversies, and I'll let you take over.
Well, I smile when you say that, because that's been out there, and I don't believe that it's real. There's a lot of science that says that it's not real. When they've done the studies on coral reefs, they use sunscreen concentrations thousands of times more than you'd see in the water in petri dishes. No. So in the real environment, you don't see that. Henry Lim also did some really good work on this. And if you look at the Great Barrier Reef, the areas with the highest concentration of sunscreen materials are not the areas where the reefs are going bad. It's really thought more they're caught by a virus. So what I tell my patients are, if you're really concerned about this, and oxybenzone is a chemical that's in many, many sunscreens, just pick a different one. That's all. But you still got to protect yourself because you're looking at a hypothetical risk of coral reefs, which has been in some cases disproved, versus a real risk of getting melanoma if you don't use it. So to me, there's the reef safe sunscreens are a little bit of a marketing thing that's out there. To me, just use a good sunscreen to protect yourself.
No, it's all great feedback. One more thing. I know that you run some of the most successful dermatology conferences. You have the winter clinical, you have the fall clinical. You gather lots of great speakers coming and to educate not only the dermatologists but the just NPs and PAs, everything. From your vantage point, what are we doing as a field? What are some of the latest progress and development for management of melanoma? What have you been hearing some of the leaders and some of the experts are talking about melanoma?
That's a great question, Steve. And we always could get better at this. I look back to when I started 40 years ago and the advances that have made over those periods of times. I think the two biggest areas, one I alluded to already, with the fact of immunologic therapy for melanoma. I mean, that's made a real difference where it's not an automatic death sentence. A melanoma the size of a dime on your skin has like a 50% chance of having already spread. So you have to, the fact that there is some treatment for that is great. But more importantly, the advances I see right now are in early detection and using technology to try to help with this. We go back to the ABCDs, where, as I said, 2 years from now will be the 40th anniversary. And there was nothing out there then to do that.
No.
And now some handheld tools. I mean, dermoscopy has made a difference to really help to identify these lesions. But more importantly, we're starting to see a lot of technology, AI kinds of things, artificial intelligence, a variety of other features, looking at the fact that malignant cells have different electrical resistance than benign cells. So there's a device that looks at that. And also looking at other wavelengths beyond the visible things we can see, looking at infrared, looking at ultraviolet, those kinds of things that we can't see with our eyes, but we can be aided with devices to look at that. There's probably 20 different technologies that are being evaluated at this point, literally, to look at this thing. And I don't know which is going to win, but I look back, our mentor, Al Koff, gave me a textbook, a dermatology textbook from 1903. If I look at that, I kind of laugh, about how they think, melanoma is caused by bad water and things of that sort. But I know they're going to look at our textbooks from, 40, 50 years from now and say, they actually had to cut these things off before they could make a diagnosis. And all these, I think of, Star Trek or something with they put the device on and heal, the electronic device. So there's a lot of energy and a lot of smart people working on these things and working at it for a bunch of different directions. And one of them will be great. I don't know which one it's going to be, but one of those technologies is going to make a big difference, I think.
No, that's a great summary. You covered dermoscopy, right? And you talked about some of the devices with dermoscopy incorporating different wavelength. And you talked about the NevaSense device that is FDA approved to looking at melanoma. We have AI algorithms. We have total body 3D imaging. We have confocal laser microscopy. And you talk about there is this company, Dermtech, to do tape stripping, right? So all those different pieces.
I would add one other thing to that, which is really genomics has made a big difference.
Sure.
That's one of the big areas.
Yeah.
But we talked about Dermtech for using genomics for diagnosing melanoma, as well as assessing prognosis with genomics, the Castle test.
Correct. Yep.
That's really made a big difference in our armamentarium of effectively assessing prognosis and diagnosing. So you're going to see more and more of this. What I honestly believe is right now we lump melanoma into one disease. And I think genomics are going to tell us that melanoma is more than one disease. We're going to find different genetic patterns of different melanomas and maybe be able to treat them with more targeted therapy. We're not even close to that yet, but that's my vision of the future.
No, I totally agree with you because we already know, right, the BRAF mutation, 50% of the melanoma because they have the single amino acid change, right? And then we know
Right.
BAP mutation that give you ocular melanoma. We know NRAS and other type of melanoma give you selective acral melanomas. So you're absolutely right. We are running out of time. I'm gonna let you have the last word. What words of wisdom, lessons, or pearls that you want to share with our audience?
Wow. My whole life has been dedicated to trying to lower disease impact, let's call it, from melanoma. And everybody can individually make a difference. We talk as a group, we want to influence public education, but every individual can make a difference. Our mentor, again, Al Koff, had the acronym WAR, W-A-R, to make war on melanoma. Wear protective clothing for W, avoid the midday sun for A, and regularly use sunscreen and sun protection.
Hmm.
And if you do those three things, we know that triad of behaviors lowers your risk. And if everybody would do that, it's kind of like cigarette smoking. It always pays to
Sure.
stop. It always pays to change your behavior. It always pays to start protecting yourself. So I think that's the most important message I'd like to get out there. You can make an individual difference in your risk by simple behavioral changes.
Darrel, thank you so much for taking the time. We covered a lot of topics. Thank you for sharing some of the history on ABCD, self-exam, and we touched a lot about sunscreen controversies. And I really, I did not know about the WAR acronym from Al Koff. Thanks again for taking the time to talk to us.
Steve, my pleasure. It's an honor to work with you as always.
Bye.